Could you just explain to our viewers why your categorisation of Sir Winston Churchill's life and career came down to he is a white supremacist mass murderer, intersposed in your tweet with a number, I think 7 or 8, clapping emojis applauding your own genius and describing Sir Winston in that manner?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's make a comparison. Piers, you're a sensitive soul. Yesterday you accused me of being a racist for pointing out that you look like honey-glazed gammon. If you want an example of real racism, you just have to look to Churchill. He talked about his belief in the triumph of the Aryan race. He hated Indians with a passion. He said they were a beastly people with a beastly religion. When a famine broke out, 3 million people starved to death. So that's why I said that he was a white supremacist. I said mass murderer because he always advocated the most violent, the most destructive option. He used poisoned gas against Kurds, against Afghans. He was a strong supporter of Britain's concentration camps in the Boer War, where 28,000 people, women and children, died. He's always advocated the use of aerial bombardments in what he described as terror bombing campaigns. In fact, his own cabinet had to stop him when he was in the cabinet in the 20s. Cabinet colleagues had to stop him from bombing protesters in Ireland.
Winston Churchill was voted the greatest Briton of the last century for a reason. Is that people believe that he almost single-handedly, through the power of his rhetoric in World War II, saved this country from the Nazis. Again, you laugh. That sneering little laugh.
That won the war. It was the soldiers, the sailors, and the airmen who won the war, and they voted him out when they came home.
Yeah, he was the British Prime Minister. He was the one making decisions which led to this country being able to stand up and save itself from Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. There is a creeping attempt now to besmirch everything that Churchill stands for. Yep. You know, I have a brother who's a British Army colonel who I talked about this to last night. He was spitting with rage from where he is currently serving his country, right? This just gets everybody's goat up. I don't defend everything Churchill did or said, right? I think he's a complex, difficult character in many ways.
As any historical hero will be.
But the idea that you simply eliminate... We heard a rant there, which at no point offered any balance or any attempt to say anything positive at all about this man.
Well, I mean, if you want an example of racism, you can read some of Gandhi's work. Now, was Gandhi a racist? No, of course he wasn't. And he was a great and important figure.
Or Nelson Mandela.
Yeah, and Mandela said and did things in his early years that he would regret in his later years. So if you want to portray somebody as a racist in the sense that Ross does with his eloquent stupidity, it's very easy to do so. But if you want to portray Churchill as a racist, my great-great-uncle and he, when they were Conservative MPs, they crossed the floor to the Liberals in part because of their outrage at the treatment of Chinese indentured labour in South Africa. Now, Ross, if he checked his history, would know that. You can say that Churchill was an old-guard Conservative, and yet he supported the People's Budget in 1911. He campaigned for better treatment for coal miners, for shop workers, and he did many things which we will now regard as being central to the foundation of the welfare state. Bengal famine, you say yourself, they had a choice between feeding Bengal and feeding the Balkans, and at the time, Churchill, one of his great attributes, he focused this nation. And Ross, again, in his sort of crude misunderstanding of history, says, oh, you know, it was the servicemen who won the war. Yes, of course, it's always the servicemen who won the war. But our political leadership was not willing to fight that war in the first place.
On Bengal, Mr. Greer, from the Cabinet Papers here, this is from direct message to Lord Wavell, his new Viceroy of India, right, from Churchill. Every effort must be made, even by the diversion of shipping, urgently needed for war purposes, to deal with local shortages in India. Then there are copies of letters he sends to the Prime Minister of Canada, to Australia, to Franklin D. Roosevelt and others, repeatedly over the next 2 years, in which he is beseeching them to help the people of Bengali. For you to categorise that as him being to blame for the deaths of 3 million people in Bengali, it's not just offensive, it is a downright lie.
No, Piers, you just don't understand history. That's the problem.
I'm reading history. I'm reading history from the Cabinet Papers, from the Cabinet Papers, quoting his own words.
So you mentioned who was then the Viceroy of India when Wavell was the Field Marshal in Winston Churchill's own war cabinet with Leo Amery, his Secretary of State for India. The two of them were sitting down planning how to get food to Bengal at the start of that famine. Churchill came in and stopped them, as is recorded in both of their diaries. In fact, Churchill spent so long stopping people from getting aid to Bengal. You mentioned Canada and Australia. Australian wheat ships were trying to dock in Calcutta, and Churchill refused. And to go back to Bob's point, it wasn't to feed people in the Balkans. It was to stockpile food in the Balkans. There were not shortages. They wanted to stockpile food in case there were future shortages, while 3 million Indians were starving to death. Parents were killing their children rather than see them starve to death. It was after a year of that Churchill finally realised. In fact, when he was getting letters from his own Secretary of State for India, his response was to complain that Gandhi hadn't died yet. He didn't care for months.
When you say he doesn't care, here's a letter he wrote to Franklin D. Roosevelt, the President of the United States. I'm seriously concerned about the food situation in India. Last year, we had a grievous famine in Bengali, through which at least 700,000 people died. This year is a good crop of rice, but we're faced with an acute shortage of wheat, aggravated by unprecedented storms. He's begging Franklin D. Roosevelt for help, but actually Roosevelt was unable to give him because he was...
That's after he had destroyed 46,000 boats that could have got food around Bengal. He let that famine happen.
So let me explain to you.
After it happened for so long, after the photos reached the rest of the world and outraged the rest of the world, he then had to do something about it.
Do you know what Sir Winston Churchill was actually doing during World War II? What is funny about any of this? What is funny about your attempts to smear the reputation of a great leader like Winston Churchill? Why do you get a kick out of this? Why do you not have any sense of honour about you, which allows you to offer even a semblance of balance? Again, you
Piers,
laugh.
It's very brave of you to talk about honour when the one thing the British public know about you is that you were sacked from a newspaper for lying about British troops on the front page and refusing to apologise for it. So it's
the reason I didn't
talk about honour.
I knew you would do this, so let me explain what happened there. I was sacked from the Daily Mirror for publishing photographs of some British troops, rogue elements of a regiment, who had been abusing Iraqis. They were held to account, and some of them were imprisoned for the abuse that they enacted. I never apologised. Because the abuse happened. I then sat down with General Nick Carter, the head of the British Army, several years ago in northern France, and he told me that I was right to publish what I published. So I'm sure you know more than the head of the British Army 2 years ago, but I suspect you don't. Rather like you don't know more than what happened in Bengal during the famine and Winston Churchill's culpability. But let me come to a wider point, and I'm sure you're going to spray gun other stuff at me about my life, which is completely irrelevant. Let me ask you...
I've lost interest in your life.
Let me ask you this. Do you believe that Winston Churchill did anything positive in World War II for the people of his country?
Yes, he showed strong leadership, but let's not pretend that that wipes away everything else he did. I mean, you talk as if almost I wouldn't exist, or I'd exist in a very different way if it wasn't for Churchill. In fact, because of Churchill, I almost didn't exist at all. Because of Churchill's hatred for the workers on the Clyde and his refusal to properly defend the Clyde, my gran was almost killed in the Clydebank Blitz. Clydebank was the only place in the UK completely destroyed by German bombing because Churchill and his government wouldn't provide ammunition to the anti-aircraft batteries in Clydebank because they hated the workers and they hated the trade unions there. Bob mentioned what he did for miners. Miners in South Wales hate Winston Churchill because he deployed troops and police officers against them when they were just campaigning for their own rights.
Okay,
there are communities across the UK, never mind Ireland, Kenya, India.
Bob, again, I asked him to say anything positive, and he immediately segues into
if Churchill was a white supremacist and Hitler clearly was a white supremacist, I mean, is there some moral equivalence between Hitler and Churchill that's being made here?
Well, Ross, I just wonder whether that was the deliberate intention of those two phrases that you used. Churchill was a white supremacist mass murderer. And if it wasn't for Sir Winston Churchill, who knows what would have happened to Great Britain?
Yeah, not just Churchill, though. If it wasn't for Churchill, President Roosevelt of America and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. But we don't pretend that Joseph Stalin was a decent man. He was a scumbag. You're not Stalinist, are you, Piers?
Thank you. That's the first word of common sense you've come up with this morning, mate.
This is about us taking a rounded view of history. You said yourselves these are complex
characters. You have no rounded view of history. You're
here
just
in the UK, we are
hater.
unable to talk.
We're
unable to talk about this without folk like yourself, Piers, having a tantrum.
You can keep
it's
talking.
Very snowflake of you.
I'm not snowflake about Winston Churchill. I know he was a flawed character. I also know that he almost single-handedly dragged this country from the abyss in World War II.
That's wildly ahistorical.
No,
wildly historical. When you say something's wildly historical, Mr. Greer, what you mean is correct, because history is history.
No,
so when you say I'm wildly historical, you mean I'm right.
You're wildly ahistorical.
You said
False.
historical.
No, that's...
No.
Yeah. And let me ask you this.
I think the thing is, Ross, you seem to be articulating a completely isolated, unique version of history. You just,
No, not at all.
Yes, well, you are, aren't you? I mean, everybody celebrates Sir Winston Churchill.
No, they don't. If you go to
hero.
India, Ireland, Kenya, they absolutely don't. If you come to communities like Clydebank that I represent, if you go to the South Wales valleys, these mining communities, the problem is these points of view that have been long held, since Churchill did things to these communities, have not been allowed to get out because the prevailing narrative is of a war hero who you cannot speak ill of. But he is a complex character, and we need to start being honest about our own history.
You can be critical, but the way that you're speaking about him, a white supremacist mass murderer...
It's disgusting. It's absolutely disgusting.
And it's the equivalence with Hitler, which I think people find really offensive.
I didn't draw an equivalence between Winston Churchill and Hitler, but did you know one of his own cabinet ministers
No one
did?
is denying that every historical hero should be scrutinised. But the use of the language is so offensive.
I was just going to completely agree with what you were saying. Nobody is saying that you can't re-evaluate people, and every generation and every great historian looks at history afresh, which is really important for us, an understanding of life. But there is a difference between a great historian summing up and re-evaluating a great man's life and your rather trite, infantile sloganeering, saying, oh, I'm going to stick a racist tag on this person or a sexist tag on that person. This is not history. This is just silly slogan
And you know
politics.
what it's become? You know what's become? It's become worse than that, is that there's a younger generation, and you'll absolutely epitomise this, who decide to twist history to suit a narrative that people like Winston Churchill are evil people who should be condemned. And you have not presented a single positive thought process about Winston Churchill at all, which I know that 95%, probably more of our viewers, will be looking at what you're saying, hearing what you're saying, with utter revulsion. And they'll be saying, why does this kid, who's 24, who's somehow been an elected official in Scotland, why does he not actually appreciate the great that Winston Churchill did, even if he doesn't like some of the other stuff that he did? And when you say that you drew no equivalence between Churchill and Hitler, we all know that Hitler was a white supremacist mass murderer. So when your only categorisation of Winston Churchill in a tweet with all your clapping emojis is that Churchill was a white supremacist mass murderer, you are doing an equivalence with Adolf Hitler. You are saying the man that saved us, you are saying the man who saved us from the Nazis is actually no better than a Nazi himself. Do you believe that Winston Churchill was any better than a Nazi?
Of course he was. Of course he was.
But you called him a white supremacist mass murderer. That's what Nazis are, Mr. Greer. So when you say, of course he was better than Nazis, actually you want the world to think that you believe he was no better than a Nazi. That's really what you want to believe, isn't it?
He was less worse than the Nazis, but his own cabinet secretary for India said himself, I cannot distinguish between Winston Churchill's views on race and Adolf Hitler's.
Right.
I wouldn't make that comparison because I think it's crass. His own cabinet minister in his wartime cabinet, a pro-empire conservative just like him, was so revolted by Churchill's hostility to the Indians as they were dying that he felt he had to make that comparison. I wouldn't because it's crass.
All right, Mr. Greer, you know what I find revolting? You.